Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay his Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah her husband told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. And she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. Amen. Last week, we learned 3 secrets of how we can move God's heart in our prayers. One of the secrets was to make a vow that will glorify God's name. So basically, we make a promise to do or offer something that will be used to glorify God's name in our prayer. In return, God will be pleased with our promise, and our prayer will be answered. So, making a vow to God was one of the secrets. Now, since making the vow to God is powerful enough to move God's heart and grant us the answer to our prayer, we must be sincere in keeping that vow. Because God is always sincere to all of His promises. God never forgets His promises and never failed to keep His promise. Remember God's promise to Abram? His promise to give him a son was kept even when Abram and Sarah was too old to have any child. Sarah couldn't bear any children anymore because she was too old. But God still kept His promise. Remember God's promise to Moses? He promised Moses that God is going to bring Israelites to the promised land. Despite the fact that Pharaoh of Egypt never wanted to release Israelites, God still delivered by performing 12 miracles. Actually, curses to Egyptian people. And even when Israelites didn't believe in God and betrayed God countless times in the desert, for over 40 years, God still delivered Israelites to the promised land. You see, God never forgets or never fails or never abandons His promises to us. God is infinite. God is righteous. So God never forgets His promise and keep His promise always. We must remember this. God is very serious about keeping promises. Therefore, we must not forget or change our mind about our vow after we get our prayers answered. There are some people who makes a vow to God in their prayers, and after God answers their prayer, they change their mind. Or sometimes they forget. If we do, we are not being sincere to our vow. And that also means we have used the vow to take advantage of our Lord God. We are using God by making vow. There's this term when we do this in our human relationship. In Korean, we call it 먹튀. In English, it's dine and dash. So you make a promise, and you don't deliver, and you just run away after you get what you want. So we must not do this with God. Remember who you are dealing with. You're making a promise to God. There's no way that you can dine and dash or 먹튀 with God. That is impossible because God will never forget. Sometimes you can run away by doing dine and dash if you're lucky enough, or the owner of the dine is clumsy, but God is not clumsy. God never forgets. Today, through Hannah, we will learn how we can keep the vow we make to God in our prayers after we get our prayers answered, because it's important. Because we're making vow to God, we need to keep the promise. But how? Who is the example that we can look up to keep our vows? So we are going to look at the story of Hannah. After Hannah's prayer at the temple, Hannah returned to her home and was, of course, God answered her prayer, and was pregnant. Her prayer was answered. Now, when the child was born, what Hannah did was to name the child Samuel or Shemuel. That means, because I asked the Lord for him. So why did Hannah name the boy Samuel? Because she wanted to remind her every day about her vow. That's the reason. She could have named him like common name, like many other names that Israelites like to, like John, or like Paul, or even Abraham. But Hannah named him Shemuel or Samuel. So every time she looks at her child, she'll remember, yes, I went to the temple and I prayed to God and I made a vow. This is very clever, good idea, since every time she's feeding her child, breastfeed the child, she'll remember Samuel. Whenever she calls a boy's name, she'll remember, I made a vow. So she's making sure that she will never forget what vow she made to God. Because we, human beings, are forgetful beings. We forget every day. We forget about our promise. We make so many promises to our loved one, family, or friends. We make little to big promises, right? But we always forget our promises. Whether it is intentional or, not intentional. We forget our promises because we are not perfect, right? We're not perfect beings. We forget things. And among all the things that we forget, there are promises. I make so many promises with my 2 sons, but sometimes I forget. What can I do? I'm a very, very forgetful person. Even the vow that we make to God can be forgotten because we're human beings. So it is important for us to do our best to remind ourselves about the vow that we made or make to God, because there's no guarantee that we will remember until we keep the vow. So we have to remind ourselves, just like Hannah. I also made a vow to God, like last week I have told you that I made a vow to become man of God if God takes care of me throughout my days, because I'm not so healthy and not smart enough to do anything. So I pray to God, if you take care of me, if you take care of my family, then I will become your tool. So to remember that vow, since I'm a very, very forgetful person, I forget so many things. So what I did was, it's very simple. I repeated that prayer every day to remind myself that I made a vow. Even though I prayed once, I would pray it every day until I would never forget that vow. So every day I would, before I sleep, I would go, you know what? Thanks for taking care of me. Like today, if you take care of me tomorrow, I'll be your man. I'll be your preacher. So I did every day. Like Hannah, when Hannah was looking at her son, she remembered. Like when I'm praying every night, when I pray that you have taken care of me, I'll be your preacher. So I can remind myself that I might have made a vow, because being a preacher is not an easy process. You have to go to theologian school. You have to serve the church for a certain amount of time. And after that, you also have to have the graduate school degree and so many things. You have to take the test. That process is not easy. Sometimes I'll feel like running away, or sometimes I'll be like, maybe I can forget about the vow that I made because I want to do something else. But then again, I'll pray that same prayer again. I will remember, yes, I made a vow and God is taking care of me. I have to keep the promise. I have to keep the vow. Like Hannah, there are many ways that you can do to remind yourself. Like me, you can repeat the prayer, or you can write it down somewhere and put it in the house, or post it in the house, or you can put it in the frame or hang it in your house, the vow. What's important is that you remind yourself about the vow. Because if you don't, I guarantee you forget about the vow. Whether you want to or not, you forget. That's a problem because you made a promise to God. You know, it would be very fun if you could share how every one of you do to remind yourself about the vow. You know, the way how you keep yourself remind about the vow that you made God. It will be funny sometimes. Someone will be like, I repeat my prayer. Someone will be like, I make a song about my vow. Or someone will be like, I made a picture about my vow and posted it in my room. You know, there will be many way of reminding yourself about the vow. So Hannah was very creative and made a permanent way to remind herself about the vow by naming her son Shemuel. And the second thing about keeping the vow is when it was time for Elkanah's family to visit the temple for annual sacrifice, because Elkanah would go to temple every year, once every year. Whole family would go up to Shiloh and go to the temple and offer a sacrifice, right? That's the time when Hannah went to the temple and prayed to God. So it was time for Elkanah's family to go to Shiloh. And Elkanah told Hannah, let's go to offer our sacrifice to our Lord. Then Hannah said, no, I'm going to stay here until my boy is weaned. That means until my boy can stop breastfeeding, old enough to, eat some food. They'll be like 3 to 4 years old, right? Very young. Because she decided to, bring him to the Lord as soon as he is weaned, as soon as he stops breastfeeding. She needed to spend little that time with her son because she's going to bring him at a very early age. To me, that seems so early, right? I mean, if a boy is weaned, that means 3 or 4 years old, that means he can barely walk. He can barely walk and he can barely eat some food. She's going to spend just 3 to 4 years with her son Samuel. This boy was given to her with so much, hardship, right? She had to go to the temple and cry out and pour out her soul to get this child. Yet, she's going to bring that boy to the temple when the boy is so young, right? So little. When she brings that boy, Samuel, to the temple, she won't be able to see him every day. The only period of time that she will be able to see her son will be the time when Elkanah's family go to the temple, which is once a year. So once she brings Samuel to the temple, she'll only see her son once a year. That's not good because I see my boys every day, but if I don't see my boys like 1 day or 2 days, I'll be like, I'll be missing my boys. I want to see my sons. But she's going to miss her son full year. I mean, mothers, when they have their newly born child, they become so attached to them, right? And their desire is to see them grow up, right? Then why did Hannah decided to bring a boy so as young as like 3 years old, right after the boy is weaned, bring him to the temple? Why? Because when she made a vow to God, she didn't say, I'm going to bring the child right after the boy is weaned. She didn't promise that, right? She didn't specify how old she's going to bring him to the temple. She only made a vow to make his life dedicated to the Lord, making him Nazirite, right? So she didn't have to bring him so early. She could have spent so much time with the boy before making him Nazirite. Maybe 7 years old. If I was Hannah, I'd be like, you know what, I want to spend my time with this boy. I'm going to bring him after like when he turns 15 years old. You know? But Hannah decided to bring him so early. Why? Because she did not want any chance of herself changing her ideas, you know, about giving her son to God. Because if she does spend much time with the boy, she'll be tempted to delay the vow. It will be more difficult for her to bring the child to the temple. You know, her desire to spend time looking after a boy will grow more and more as she spends more and more time. Not only that, if Samuel spends more time with his mother, he'll be attached to his mother, right? If he becomes like, let's see, 4 to 5 years old, even 4 years old, a child can recognize mother, right? And if he becomes 5 years old, he will not be separated from his mother. He'll be like, oh, mother, don't send me away. Because they can speak when they turn 5 years old. And Hannah knew this. If I bring the boy after 4 or 5 years old, when he turns 4 or 5 years old, I won't be able to, be separated from my lovely son. And he won't be separated from me. So she decided, right after the boy is weaned, after he's able to eat some food, I'm going to bring him to the Lord. Because that's the right time. That's the adequate time for me to bring Samuel to the temple. Any more delay, it's going to hard for me to separate it from my son. You see, when you take too much time or delay your vow intentionally, it will only make it difficult for you to keep the promise with God. Whatever the vow you make with God, you must, keep the vow as soon as possible. Because if you have so much time to think about it, you'll be really tempted. My vow was special because my vow had to take, lifetime, right? I made a vow to God that I'll be His tool, which means my whole life I'm going to be your tool. That means from the beginning of the prayer until the day I die, I have to keep the vow. So I have lifetime to think about my vow. And I know what it is to be tempted because I was tempted so many times. I wanted to escape. I wanted to forget my vow. I wanted to, not go to theologian school. I wanted to, stop right after graduating. I wanted to, maybe I will take another job. Maybe I'll try another profession. Even right now, I have 2 jobs, right? But every time I feel tempted, I remind myself, no, I shouldn't. Every time I try to think about it, I tell myself, no, thinking about more about this is only making it for me too difficult to keep the vow. So Hannah, I think Hannah was a very smart woman because she named her son Samuel to remind herself, and she brought Samuel when he was so young so that she could not be tempted to change her mind. She's a very smart person. Maybe that's why she's recorded in the Bible, right? So when we make a vow to God, as soon as our prayer gets answered, keep the vow. Don't delay it. Whatever your vow is, keep it because God has answered your prayer. It is time for you, time for us to keep the promise because God is sincere to His promise. So we should be also sincere to our promise. And also when we make a prayer with vow that would move God's heart, we are asking from God something that is impossible for us to do, right? We are praying to God because we couldn't do something. We are praying to God because we want something that we can't do, right? Which also means that the vow we make in such prayer is the vow that is not easy to keep, right? We don't just make a vow, simple vow to God when we are asking something impossible from God, right? We make a vow that is normally difficult for us to keep. That pleases God, so we get our answers, right? Like Hannah. Hannah offered her son to be dedicated to God. Hannah is asking for a son, so Hannah is offering what she is asking from God. That is not easy. That's why to keep such promise is not easy task. Making a vow to God is not easy, and also keeping that promise is not easy too. Especially when we are trying to keep it alone. You could say the vow was made between me and God, so it is only my job to keep the vow. You could think like that, It's my vow, so I should keep the vow. But the vow to God is not a burden. When you say, I have to keep this vow by my own self, you're making it a burden because the vow that you made to God, the vow that you make to God, it's not easy vow, right? So when you're trying to keep it alone, sometimes it could be very difficult for you. If you feel difficult to do something, it becomes a burden, right? The vow is not a burden or the test from God. So it is okay to share what kind of vow that you made to God with someone you love or with your family or your faith community. In fact, it is good for you to share the vow. Because when you share the vow, they will know what kind of prayer that you made, made to God and what kind of answer you've got from God. And they will also know the vow that you made to God. When somebody knows about your vow, you push yourself to keep the vow, right? They can also remind you about the vow that you made. When you're trying to do something else and they'll be like, wait a minute, you told me that you made this vow, right? And you got your answer from God. Why are you not keeping the vow? So when you share the vow with your, whoever, your family or friend or your faith community, you also remind yourself about the vow, and also they can help you to keep the vow. Hannah, when she made a vow to, God, the vow was to offer her son to the Lord, right? That means it does not only affect Hannah, but also affect her husband Elkanah, because Samuel is also Elkanah's son, right? So what Hannah did was to share the vow to Elkanah. Now, if Elkanah didn't want to keep the vow, he could cancel the vow. That's possible, because he has a right. Because Samuel is not only Hannah's son, but also Elkanah's son. And Elkanah, since he's the man and the owner of the household, he can pay some certain amount of, sacrifice to relieve Samuel from his vow. He can do it. According to Leviticus, when somebody makes a vow to God to offer someone, they can pay it by, giving out certain amount of money or sacrifice. Elkanah could have done that. But when Elkanah heard about this vow, when Elkanah realized that Hannah's prayer was answered by God, by the blessing of God, the sincerity of God, Elkanah agreed to this vow. And when Hannah suddenly announced that she's going to bring this boy to the temple right after he's weaned, Elkanah didn't disagree. According to our story today, Elkanah actually agreed and even supported her and encouraged her, saying, "Do whatever you want." Now we know that Elkanah loved Hannah, right? But offering his son is a different story, right? Like Hannah, just because Elkanah loved Hannah so much, that we can also assume that Elkanah loved this boy so much, right? Because when you love your wife, of course you love your child, born out of your loved wife. So if Hannah brings this child to the temple, Elkanah also won't be able to see his loving son, every day. But Elkanah decided to support Hannah's decision to bring this boy, this Samuel, to the temple right after he's weaned. So what's happening here is that Hannah, since although she named her son Samuel to remind herself about the vow, and also decided to bring this boy so early, Hannah wanted someone to support her. Because since we are all human beings, and Hannah is also a human being, there's a chance that she could change her mind. So what she did to make sure that she will keep the vow, she shared that vow with her husband. And her husband, like a loving husband he is, decided to support her. So what's happening here is Hannah sharing her vow to her husband, and her husband helping her to keep the promise to God. So what we must learn from this story is that we should be actually sharing our vow to our faith community, so that we can get a support, and so that we can be helped to keep that vow. Because the vow that we make to God is not an easy vow. It is a very special vow. Sometimes it is very difficult vow to keep. Sometimes people make a vow to God which is very impossible vow. But what's amazing is they really keep the vow. Why? Because they get help from others. And sometimes God even helped the person to keep the vow. It's funny, right? We make the vow to God, and God helps us to keep the vow. That's how loving and generous and sincere God is. See who we are dealing with? It is God, right? So, with these three things that she did, she was able to keep the vow. First, remind yourself about the vow that you made during the prayer that God answered, so that you can keep the vow. Second, after making the vow, do not delay your vow. Right after you get the answer from the prayer, if it's possible, keep the vow, keep the promise right away. Do not delay it. Do not think about too much about the vow. Because if you think about the vow too much, it will be more difficult for you to keep the vow. And third, if possible, do not try to keep the promise alone because it will be difficult. Right? They're saying in Korea, lifting a paper is easy, but if you have more people lifting it, it's much more easier, right? So, if you want to keep the promise really with God, share the vow. Sharing it will help you remind yourself about the vow, and will also get a support from the people you share the vow, and will also get help from the people you share the vow with. And above all, remember why you made that vow in the first place. That's the last thing. Remember. And remember the blessing that you've got, because God answered your prayer, right? You made the vow and God answered your prayer. God has been sincere to your promise and granted the impossible for you, right? It is your turn, it is our turn to keep the promise and show our sincerity and show our gratitude to our God. You know, you could be tempted to delay or reduce the vow or even stop keeping the vow, but do not take the temptation because God has answered your prayer, right? And God never fails to keep the promise, so we should not fail to keep the promise to God. Hannah was faithful to her vow, and you know what? There's something that comes after keeping our vow. Because God is so loving, God is so always giving. When God decides to give, God gives much, much, much and much more than you even imagined. After Hannah keeping a vow, bringing her son to Samuel to temple, God blessed her with more children. You know, Hannah was only asking for a son, right? Just a son, one child. But after keeping the vow, Hannah didn't ask for it, but God, because God was so pleased about, Hannah keeping the vow, even though it was, it was a rightful thing to do. God didn't have to bless her more because Hannah was just keeping the vow. Anyway, God blessed Hannah with more children. Because God knew, Hannah is trying her best to, keep the vow. She brought me the son when he's so young. But thinking about it, she won't be seeing her son every year. I should comfort her by giving her more children. That's what God thought, and that's what God did. Sons and daughters. You see, keeping the vow could be hard for us to keep, but when you do, you'll be more blessed. That's how God is, because God is love. Because God is the source of our blessing. So which means you lose nothing, right? Nothing to lose. Some people think that, I made a vow to give something very precious to me, to God. It feels, how do you call it? I'm losing something but you're not. What's happening is, if you give one thing, God will give you more things, like 10 things to you. That's how God is. And what's more important is that this son that Hannah gave to God became the savior of people of Israel. Because at that time, religious leaders were corrupted, right? So when Hannah gave her son to God, God decided to use this son, Samuel, to become the new leader of people of Israel, replacing all those corrupted leaders, religious leaders. And as we know, he became the religious leader of Israelites. And even at the time of people of Israel decided to have a king, Samuel still was the leader to the people. So keeping the vow, you don't actually lose anything. Actually, it's another blessing. So you get your prayer answered, and you get more blessings out of keeping your vow. So keep the promise to God. Remember about the story of Hannah and Samuel and her husband Elkanah. And then do what you have to do to keep the vow. And I'm assuring you that vow is going to bring you to the road of blessing from our God. Let us pray.